Hello class, today we're going to talk about the Greek period. This period covers around the 3rd century to the year 0 BC. Before we talk about the Greek period, let's back up a little bit and talk about the post-exile. So, after the Babylonian exile, the Persians allowed the Israelites to return to Israel. And they tried to rebuild their culture. They rebuilt the temple. Remember under Zerubbabel, they rebuilt the temple. Under Ezra, they tried to rebuild their culture and their religion. And under Nehemiah, they rebuilt the city walls. All of this was about rebuilding the nation, both religiously and culturally. From the time the Israelites entered the Promised Land, before King David, during the period of Joshua and the Judges, all the way up until the time of the birth of Jesus, the common theme you're going to see again and again and again was keeping the nation pure of outside influences, both religiously and culturally. So you go back to from the period of the Judges all the way up until the exile. It's about the Canaanites not having these foreign Canaanite gods and these foreign sacrifices. They were trying to keep the religion pure in that aspect. After the exile, it was to keep the religion pure from the Samaritans. The Samaritans practiced a Judaism that was very, very different. After the Greek and Roman conquest, it was about keeping the religion and the nation pure from these Hellenistic concepts, these Hellenistic cultural ideas that were infiltrating the nation. So because of the Babylonian exile, you saw many, many Jews now living outside of Israel. After the Babylonian exile, you saw more Israelites living outside of Israel than inside of Israel. And because of this, the synagogue becomes a huge, important aspect. Scribes also become big. Scribes, their job was to read, to write, and to interpret the Torah, the law. So scribes become really, really big deal. Before the Babylonian exile, the temple really was the center of the Jewish faith. But because so much diaspora, so many Jews living outside of Israel, the temple was no longer as central in the faith as it used to be. The role of a scribe, of a rabbi within a synagogue became exceedingly important. Under the Persians, life was pretty good. They have a good amount of religious freedom. The Persians were rather tolerant. Their Zoroastrianism was very tolerant. They weren't an evangelical, which means they did not try to spread or evangelize other groups. Because of this, the Persians, basically, you paid your taxes, you sent your tithe to the capital, and you kind of did whatever you wanted to. But after the Persians were defeated in the famous Greco-Persian War, Alexander the Great comes in and he conquers Israel. Now, at first, this wasn't so bad for the Israelites. They just go being under control of one empire to under control of the other. After Alexander the Great's death, his empire was split amongst his 3 sons. Israel was really right in the middle of these two of these aspects. One was in Egypt, the other was in the Persia, Assyria area, north of Israel. And because of this, being right in the middle, they were fought over frequently. Now, these 3 parts that the empire was broken into, naturally, they go to war against each other. So you had these 3 Greek-ish nations who fought with each other for 2 to 3 centuries. Well, the Ptolemies, they were rather tolerant as well, until a new group comes in, and right after 200 BC, they conquer Israel, and they were not tolerant at all, especially toward the end of their reign. They had very little concept of religious freedom. They tried to impose Hellenism. Remember from your reading, Hellenism is the spread of Greek ideas, and eventually it became known as the spread of Roman ideas as well. Under Hellenism, they tried to spread everything Greek. You see, why spread Greek culture? It's actually very, very simple. If you want to have a unified nation, the best way to do that is have a unified culture. And enculturation, if you bring in these outside nations and they have the same religion, the same culture, the same customs, the same standards, they won't want to rebel. However, if they are different religiously, politically, culturally, they will always want to pull apart. You see this throughout the world. There's a pocket of Spain and eastern Spain. They want to have freedom because they're different than the rest of Spain. In northern Iraq, the Kurds, they want freedom because why? Because culturally and religiously, they're different. They feel like they're different than the rest of the nation of Iraq, so they want freedom. And Alexander the Great, he was very smart in knowing that in order to not have these nations desire freedom, you have them have the same culture. Because of this, you saw Greek schools pop up everywhere to teach the Greek language. The Greek money was found everywhere throughout the empire. Today, archaeologists, they find Greek money all the way from Greece to India. Greek money was common everywhere. Greek clothing spread like wildfire. Greek food, the Greek, they wouldn't just encourage, sometimes even force the eating of Greek food. In fact, sometimes they would force these cultures to not keep their own food customs. They would force people, literally force people to eat pig. That's how much they wanted this Hellenism idea. Religion, of course, was part of it. They would force religion. But also, it went as far as into sports. Greek wrestling became very popular all throughout. You saw these arenas where they practice all these Greek sports. At first, you just saw them in Greek. But after Alexander the Great, you saw them all throughout the Middle East. Hellenism spread like wildfire because the Greeks forced it spread like wildfire. Under the Seleucid Empire, the spread of Hellenism took a really oppressive tone. They went as far as the abomination of desolation. What they did was they took a statue of Zeus and put it on the high altar of the temple. So imagine someone taking a statue of, I don't know, the devil and sticking it upon our chapel. As you walk by the chapel, would you find a little bit of anger, resentment? You want to rebel against the people that did this to you? Well, that's what happened to the Jews. This forced Hellenism was gotten so bad that it led to the Maccabean revolt. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are about a family of these brothers, and they lead this rebellion, this revolution against the Greeks, and they actually win. They win this revolution. It tells a long story of this war, of how the Jews were oppressed and they were murdered for keeping their Jewish customs and religion and faith, and how they fought back and overthrew their Greek rulers. After the Maccabean revolts, you have the reinstitution of the temple. So because the Greeks had controlled the temple, they desecrated it. They had religious practices that were against the Jewish faith, and the Jews, when they retook the temple, they had to rededicate the temple. This is where the celebration of Hanukkah goes in. If you don't know what the purpose of Hanukkah is, it's about the rededication of the temple. So the story goes that they had to rededicate the temple, but to do so, they needed certain religious oils. But it would take 8 days to purify, to make the right oils for the dedication of the temple. However, they only had enough oil for 1 day. And the story goes that this oil miraculously lasted for 8 days after supposed to only being burned out after 1. That's why Hanukkah is called the Festival of Lights, because this oil, which lit up the temple, lasted 8 miraculous days. That's why a Hanukkah menorah has 8 candles. Hanukkah, it's really a festival about Jewish independence, and it's a festival about God's love for his people. Well, after the Israelites won, you have the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty is an independent Jewish nation, and you would think this would be awesome. The Israelites were under a foreign rule for almost 400 years, from the Babylonians until the mid-100s. They were under foreign rule, but now they were free. They had an independent Jewish nation. You'd think this was awesome, but honestly, it really wasn't. The Hasmoneans, they were not that great. They were fairly corrupt. They really weren't very strong leaders. They didn't follow God very closely. They honestly weren't a very strong nation. And the Israelites, for about this 100-year period, were pretty much not all that existent in the world stage. Around the year 67 BC, the Romans come and they take over. They conquer under the General Ptolemy, and the Israelites were once again under foreign rule. Now, the Romans actually, they learned the lesson from the Greeks, and the Romans allowed religious freedom for the Israelites. However, they still oppressed them and taxed them heavily. This leads to Herod the Great. If you know Herod the Great, he is the king of Israel during the birth of Jesus. He died right after Jesus' birth. We will talk more about Herod the Great when we talk about the New Testament. Until then, God bless you all.